G'day. This is the first lecture in the Imperialism unit. If American imperialism was a book, it would be centered around the year 1900. In 1900, the United States is going to fight a war called the Spanish-American War, and we are going to acquire our very first and our only colony. Now, for many idealists out there, you may think, isn't that anti-American or un-American? Seeing as how we were a colony, and we didn't like that experience of having been a colony, didn't we resist colonization all these years? When we grew as a nation, we always accepted new areas in, whether it be Texas or the Mexican Cession or Oregon. We brought them in and made them equal to the original 13 states. And I would say you idealists are absolutely correct. But there's another group of people who are out there that also help to determine our foreign policy, and those people I call realists. One is not better than the other. We always have foreign policy that kind of consists of both groups, idealists and realists. And realists looked at the fact that anytime you had a foreign power on our borders, that was not necessarily a safe way for us to live. So what can we do about it? Let's take that over. Let's take that over. Well, realists by 1900 were believers in social Darwinism, a term that we've used in earlier units to describe how businesses fought for survival. In fact, it could really be applied to any man-made organization, not just businesses. So nations also subscribe to this theory that the strongest will survive and the weak shall perish. And if you look at trends through history, wherever you see populations that sort of gel together, large populations with large territories, large navies, those are the countries that are the survivors. And so many people believed that around 1900, the United States had a large economy. We were becoming a large territory. We needed to continue to expand if we were going to compete with other nations that worked on that level. Now we're talking about playing in the big leagues with Great Britain and France and Spain. So, American imperialism. If it was a book, here's what the chapters would look like. I flashed this card for you folks at home who have not seen this lecture live in class to take these notes. You can pause the lecture and take down the notes and then continue it. And in the event that I say something in this lecture that you don't understand, all you need to do is rewind, and you can re-listen to me a couple of times if necessary. And if that still hasn't helped, then jot down questions about what you don't understand from the lecture and bring it into our next class, and we'll talk about it, okay? All right, so American imperialism, resistance. As I've said, Americans resist the idea of conquest, of going someplace and conquering it simply to be able to take its natural resources or to create a market. That there should be a fairer way to be able to go about doing that. And we'll come back to this point when we talk about China and the open door notes. But right now, the whole idea of resistance to American colonialism, it existed in America in 1900. Americans were not easy about creating a colony. Americans were divided, as I said, between the realists and the idealists, and that whole idea of social Darwinism really dominated the realists. The idealists looked at manifest destiny, and if we were to expand beyond into the Pacific Ocean, which is kind of what this lecture is about, they believed that we were spreading Christianity, we were spreading democracy, we were looking at the values of our founding fathers and wanting to bring those values to people around the world, that they weren't just values for us, they were values for others. We're talking about our third set of notes now. That kind of takes us through what I wanted to say about manifest destiny, about America's resistance to the idea that we're out there for conquest and profit. Well, we're out there for other reasons. But realists understand that we're out there for profit. We've got businesses that are out there and they need to make money. And government, it needs to have a revenue source. It needs to have that income being made by corporations, by companies that it can tax. So the realists are understanding this is the way things work and this is what we need. So westward expansion kind of ends when we hit the big drink called the Pacific Ocean. Where do we go next? Well, this is where we went next. So taking you through this, prior to the Civil War in 1854, Commodore Perry heads on off with authorization from President Fillmore to open up Japan. And what this means is, looking at the history of the islands of Japan, they'd been closed off for 200 years, with only the Dutch and I believe the Chinese having any access whatsoever through one port city. But otherwise, they had pretty much closed off their territory. We, for our part, were looking to trade in the Orient, whether it be in the Philippines, toward India, China, wherever it is that our trade was. We needed a place where we felt that if our sailors were shipwrecked, they would be safe. They were not safe on the islands of Japan. If we needed a coaling station or a place to resupply our ships, Japan would be perfectly situated for doing that. So Commodore Perry sailed to Japan, and as his black ships were called because they belched out this black smoke, the Japanese were found to be in a state of medieval development. They were still swinging swords. They had samurai and that sort of thing. So they were like the Middle Ages when Commodore Perry was able to come and negotiate a treaty. The overwhelming power that he displayed by showing up onto the shores of Japan twice, first with a squadron, a Navy squadron powered by steam powered ships, and then secondly showing up with an even bigger fleet the second time to negotiate the Treaty of Kanagawa, had the Japanese give trade concessions that were clearly unequal, and we were considered the superior. Perhaps we would have continued down this path, except that the Civil War occurred in the 1860s, and we were unable to really function until probably the 1880s. In 1867, we did happen to purchase Alaska, and that is something that began to expand our holdings into the Pacific area beyond our west coast. By the 1890s, we had annexed Hawaii, the Midway Islands, Samoa, and eventually the Spanish-American War. We're going to be winning the Philippines as a concession from Spain when we're victors in that war. Besides the Philippines, what we're really after is the big prize, which is China, trade in China. Now, Japan, an independent nation that we never really conquered, had been on a path to modernize from the 1850s forward. And by 1895, they were an industrial power that was one to be reckoned with. They defeated China in 1895 in a war and Russia in 1905. So clearly, this is a nation that has risen to a point where we released them from the unequal treaties. We were recognizing them as an equal. Maybe not a social equal, but certainly an economic military one in the Pacific. With China in disarray after the Japanese beat them in a war, many of the European countries were simply carving up China into their own little spheres of influence. So the city of Guangzhou or Canton or Shanghai would become the center of a sphere of influence of trade that maybe only Britain controlled, or only Germany, or only France. And the United States did not want to actually go and colonize in that manner, and this is happening right on the cusp of our preparedness to take the Philippines as a colony. We hadn't reached that point, so we were floating something known as the Open Door Notes, which was basically asking the other nations that were carving up spheres of influence to recognize the United States as having a right to trade in these places. And the notes are nothing more than diplomatic notes saying, please respect our presence in your area. It didn't mean that we necessarily got respect, but we certainly were requesting it. So the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was caused in part by people like Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted to see America expand. And he was not the first person to kind of put out this idea that the United States needed to expand its presence in the world. Alfred Mahan, who's mentioned here as an author, is someone who actually advocated for a strong military navy, a strong navy to protect our trade and our trade interests in other parts of the world. So there was a huge pressure at this time for the United States to kind of join the big dogs in the way that they did business. Here are three more reasons for the Spanish-American War to occur. Economic interests, we're obviously looking to reach ourselves out, and it's not just in the Pacific Ocean. The next lecture is going to deal with what we did in the Latin American region, but certainly in the Pacific, there is so much opportunity to make money. Humanitarianism actually brought us into the war as well. The way in which Spain treated her colonies became an issue in the United States because of some of the deplorable conditions that existed, whether it be in the Latin American region where Spanish colonies existed, or in the Pacific, such as the Philippines. But I always go back to the economic interests. If you want to know why anybody does anything, follow the money. So yellow journalism, the last piece of this is a different sort of money making. These were newspapers here in New York that actually depended on having great sensational stories to sell their newspapers, and they really hyped up anything that would have helped lead the United States into this war, where there probably wasn't grounds for war. The newspaper created a war mood within America. And there was an incident that occurred that was like a diplomatic insult, which perhaps could have been ignored, except the newspapers really made hay out of it, exaggerating the incident. There was an unfortunate accident to an American ship at a port in Cuba, a Spanish possession. And the newspapers created a sensationalized story about how the ship was attacked by a Spanish mine. And so all of these things that try to help move America toward this war. Now, the war was brief. Teddy Roosevelt liked to call it a splendid little war. There were a number of casualties, certainly in the war, as there ever would be, but this is the first time the United States has gotten involved in something that looked a little bit more modern since the Civil War. In the end, with a victory, we're going to see Teddy Roosevelt catapulted in politics because he had quit his job as Assistant Secretary of Navy. He had organized a group to head up what's called the Rough Riders. He was the second in command. And his financial resources helped bring cameras and other things out to one of the most spectacular victories in the Spanish-American War, called the Charge of San Juan Hill, which he was a part of this battle. And so it became the big battle of the Spanish-American War. He's going to be propelled into politics. He'll become the New York governor after this war is done, and then ultimately vice president and then president of the United States. And we've already talked about Teddy Roosevelt's history and how he became president, but this is the war that helped catapult him. Here's the last notes for today's lecture, and I will talk about them here in a second. Spain is going to lose the war to the United States, and with that, she's going to lose some of her possessions. Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, just as an example of some. I think Guam as well. The United States will pay a small sum of money, and the treaty will be signed, and it'll all be over. And when it's over, the United States will actually have a colony, which is the Philippines. So imperialism, here we come. It's a done deal now, and we'll have the Philippines as an American colony until 1946. Cuba will be controlled by the United States, even though she's independent and supposedly sovereign. We will control her through a little addition to her constitution that we call the Platt Amendment, and that's going to always allow us to be able to supersede or override any decision that Cuba makes. The Philippines are ultimately going to become part of the United States, and as you know today, citizens of Puerto Rico are citizens of the United States. It is an American protectorate, it is a territory at this point, and it qualifies for statehood. It just requires the people of Puerto Rico to want to be a state. They've held that election many times, it's not an election, but they've held that referendum many times in Puerto Rico, and it has always been defeated by the population there. I believe that is all that I need to say about this lecture. So thank you for tuning in, and to get credit for having listened to this lecture, all you need to do is bring to me a handwritten copy of all the notes that you saw today on this film. All right, thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.